addition, that is why in the presentation we made today, we gave the example of Brazil and Turkey, which imposed bans on import of electric vehicles from China, but incentivized China setting up shop for electric vehicle manufacturing inside the country, inside their countries. That's an example. I'm not saying that is the policy we need to adopt with respect to any particular sector. That needs to be identified. But it is a question of import dependence, A, disincentivizes manufacturing, B, the supply can always be turned off. Whereas domestic production inside the country is a different ball game. It allows export capabilities to grow in the country, transfer of know-how happening, etc. So we need to strike the right balance between the two. And that is an issue we are throwing up for further examination and reflection.
Interesting. So very interesting themes that you've built on. And you're looking at this from an economic prism. It will also be interesting to see how they play out from a defense and political prism.
There are multiple angles to it. Yeah.
Sure, but you're also being prudent because you're saying, why allow imports to go up from China? Why don't you just allow those companies to come in, invest? It will also create jobs in the Indian economy. So that's one way of looking at it. Let's see what the finance minister says. I have a lot more questions to ask you, but I know it's a very busy day and I won't hold you back, but I hope we'll get another opportunity to talk to you. Dr. Nageswaran, for your time and for your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The results in the general elections provide the political context for this union budget. Before the elections, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman chose the path of fiscal conservatism, not wanting to recklessly open the government's purse strings, thinking that they had a clear majority well in sight. These results have come as a political shock for the government, suggesting that there are very clear signs of distress, particularly in rural areas. And the government's effort very clearly in the union budget will be to try and address the triple challenges of job creation, of investment, and of spurring growth. So how should the government really be looking at these challenges? What could the policy measures really be? And what should you expect? To talk about this, I'm joined on this panel by a super sharp set of economists. Allow me to welcome first Neelkant Mishra, Chief Economist at Axis Bank, also Chairperson of the Unique Identification Authority of India, or Aadhaar. Thank you very much for joining us, Neelkant. We have Dr. Prachi Mishra, a Professor of Economics and Director at the head of Ashoka Isaac Center for Public Policy. Before this, Dr. Mishra has been the former Chief of Systemic Issues at the International Monetary Fund, and she's been a former Managing Director at Goldman Sachs. We have Professor Arun Kumar, who always has very interesting and contrarian takes on what's at play. And with me for perspective is my colleague and Business Today Television's Managing Editor, Siddharth Zarabi. I want to start straight up with the jobs challenge because make no mistake, India has a jobs crisis at its hand. If you look at any job vacancy that gets posted, you've got thousands of youngsters queuing up for jobs. And that's the one thing all people who are watching tomorrow would really be looking at least the Aam Aadmi would be looking at. There you see some images recently from Mumbai airport where thousands of people turned up for a few hundred jobs that had been advertised. Similar scenes coming in from different parts of the country. So on the Budget Intelligence dashboard, let me just show you what the numbers for unemployment are. Remember, unemployment, highly politically contentious in our country. But if I just look at data provided by the Center for the Monitoring of the Indian Economy, this is your annual unemployment rate for financial year 24. It stood at 8%, which was 7.6% in financial year 23. So I want to start by getting Neelkant Mishra to talk about what realistically can Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman do. There's been a lot of talk about employment-linked incentives, ELIs. Like you've got production-linked incentives, allow for incentives to be linked to actual jobs being created. How do you see this potentially play out? How is it played out internationally? And what do you see the Finance Minister actually being able to do? Neelkant Mishra.
Yeah, so I think the government needs to resist the temptation to intervene directly and try to find shortcuts to create jobs. I think the approach taken by the government so far that we need to provide consistency in policy, we need to provide macroeconomic stability, We need to bring down long-term interest rates so that the private sector can go ahead and invest. We need to start easing regulations. In fact, the economic survey makes some very, very strong statements about how a government that gives up, so it's very tempting to hold on to power, but by giving away some of its power, it will make life easier for so many people. So I think those are measures which can allow the private sector to get the visibility that it needs to start investing and then create jobs. I think the temptation to start spending fiscal resources, which are very precious, remember that not only is our economy 7 to 9% below where it was supposed to be, 1 to 1.5 years behind where it was supposed to be if the pandemic had not happened, the debt to GDP of the government, state plus center, is still about 80%. So in this context, I think it's important for the government to stay fiscally prudent, stay focused on the medium term, and focus on bringing down the long-term cost of capital and provide greater visibility on regulations. Those would be the priorities in my view.
So you're advocating what has been the thinking in the government before the elections. Dr. Mishra, do you see that change? Do you think now there is extra pressure on Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman to do some of the things that this government has been wary of doing over the past 10 years? Because they've just realized that on the ground, things aren't quite as hunky-dory as they'd imagined. And also, if I look, for example, at capital formation and how that figure has not really changed in the way that the government would have wanted. The government would have wanted for gross fixed capital formation to go up. If you see, it stays a straight line, 33.4% in financial year 22, 33.5% in financial year 24. So the investment boom that was expected when corporate taxes were reduced hasn't really kicked off in the way that the government would have wanted. Should they stay the old conservative course, or do you think the new political reality warrants the government being more aggressive than it was in the past?
Much for having me here. You've asked many questions together. So let me start with the employment. I think the employment question, which is I think the big picture question you asked. And I actually completely agree with Neelkant. I think the idea is not to, I think as long as, growth is a necessary condition for employment, and the employment, I think the survey rightfully, first of all, acknowledges that we've grown quite impressively, and going forward lays out a path and what needs to be done. If you look at, official data, facts from the official data, there has been a surge in agricultural employment from the PLFS, and that's explained partly by reverse migration and the entry of women into the labor force in rural area. So, which is, which is number one good news. Yeah, the other good news, which the survey also talks about, is an average annual increase of 4% in 4% employment in larger factories with more than 100 workers from the ASI. Again, I think this is good news because factories with large number of workers, despite a larger base, are actually growing employment at a reasonable pace. I think I think the survey also calls for a timelier and more disaggregated data of unemployment. And here it makes an important point that, given the succession of shocks that has hit the Indian economy and the global economy, claiming that India's ability to create, employment, you can, pull pictures and show us, saying that it's structurally impaired might be really unwarranted. And therefore, I think some of the subtle points in the survey about how to build statistical system, and in fact, some of the there are already excellent initiatives underway at the ministry at MOSPI, such as reducing the number of revisions in the data, increasing the frequency of surveys. So I think bottom line, I think I completely agree with Neelkant that I think the employment issue has to be thought of, has to be considered in a wider perspective. You can't just start throwing fiscal resources at creating employment, number one. And number two, again, I think, to get a better sense of the employment picture, we need way more data and evidence than what we have. Let me stop here.
Okay, very interesting. The first two experts we spoke to, Professor Kumar, arguing that there is no need for financial incentives for employment. You look at the big picture, you try and spur growth, you try and spur investment, and that by itself will lead to job creation. You don't throw incentives and SOPs just at job numbers. In any case, in countries like the United States, we've seen those numbers potentially being fudged, and in India, Jugaad could really kick into high gear and there could be all kinds of problems. Is that a perspective that you accept, or do you think that this is old world thinking, the new political reality warrants that Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman and Prime Minister Modi both deal with the job challenge more aggressively and more directly?
So, the job challenge has to be understood in its totality. And I think the two speakers earlier have mentioned that. But once you say totality, we have to see how to disaggregate it. Because we have the unorganized sector employing 94% of the workforce and the organized sector employing 6%. Now, government by itself cannot create that many jobs because out of 600 million labor force, we have only 18 million in the government jobs, public sector jobs. So you can increase it to maybe by 2 million, 3 million, but that's not going to solve the problem. What we have is a problem where there's not only unemployment, there's massive underemployment. Because our definition of employment is 1 hour of work per week and we call them employed. That's totally inadequate. Then we have disguised unemployment in agriculture and in other services sector. And then we have those people who have completely stopped looking for work, and those numbers are very large. So how do we improve the situation? We have to have a disaggregated view where we promote the unorganized sector. We have actually been denting the unorganized sector through demonetization, GST, which is faulty, NBFC crisis, and then the lockdown and the pandemic. So this sector has been in the decline. And that's why you have this vast problem of unemployment, because 94% people are employed there. And if that sector declines, then there'll be a massive unemployment problem. The organized sector, which only employs 6%, is not going to solve the problem. So we have to reprioritize. Our priority has been to invest in the organized sector. But we know that because of mechanization and automation, that's not going to create many jobs. So we have to reprioritize. Like, for instance, in the budget, in the interim budget, we plan for 11.11 lakh crores of capital investment. Bulk of that is going into capital-intensive infrastructure like railway freight corridor and highways and things like that, power and so on. Whereas we've reduced, expenditure on rural employment guarantee scheme, in rural development, in education and health. Education and health can employ a lot of people, but in real terms, those expenditures have come down rather than going up.
Okay, so that you've been speaking along with your team to a lot of officials involved in the budget making exercise. How are they looking at the job challenge? Because the opposition says it's a crisis, the government citing Employee Provident Fund data to show how new people are logging in and actually there is no crisis. So A, there's a debate on whether there is a crisis and the extent of the crisis. B, your understanding of the thinking within government on how to deal with it.
These conversations lead us to one major data point. If you take all the centrally sponsored schemes, including one whose end date was 31st March 2024, there are almost 10 different heads under which the government of India, the center, directly and indirectly aims to boost employment. There's an era pre-COVID and post-COVID. And post-COVID, if we recall, the EPFO subvention, where new recruits were to be, the government was paying their provident fund, which has led to an increase in EPFO numbers that keep getting frequently cited. But all of this pales in comparison given the sheer number of people who seek jobs. There was criticism of that PF scheme because it limited employees earning to 15,000 rupees, which, as we know in today's days and age, is a very, very low salary. The key point made in the economic survey today is it says that nearly 7.85 million, 78.5 lakh new non-farm sector jobs need to be created. And I'm reminded of what a Citibank report had said, that growth of 7% may not yield the kind of employment that we need. So it's perhaps time, Rahul, that many of these schemes, which also, by the way, include the Mudra Yojana, very famous conversations around that, they are put together and a composite number where the center supports direct employment creation and indirect. And of course, there's a labor ministry demand that we are told in the run-up to this budget, where they have specifically coined a term said to be around employment-linked incentive scheme to be brought in. Will that happen? We don't know. But let me tell you that for 10 years now, The government of India has intervened. Has it been effective? That's still a debate that we can continue to have.
Okay. In the second part of the program, I want to deal with consumption. And this is linked to the suggestion that there is, especially in rural India, a consumption crisis where people don't have enough money, they aren't spending. So let me show you some data. I look at two kinds of data. I'll start, for example, with the year-on-year change in consumption figures. So if you look at the private consumption expenditure and you look at the year-on-year change, in financial year 24, the year-on-year change in comparison with last year was just 4%. In FY22, private consumption grew up 11.7%, but that's also on a low base effect caused by the pandemic, came down to 6.8% and then to 4%. So I want Neelkant Mishra to first talk about consumption, this idea that especially in rural areas, consumption's not growing, that there is distress and the data shows that, and how should Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman potentially be dealing with this question and challenge? Neelkant Mishra.
Yes, so let's put it in a cyclical and a structural context. The first is that there is slack in the labor market. I mean, we discussed that there is the overall output, the economy is about 1 to 1.5 years behind where it was supposed to be. So that means that 1 to 1.5 years of additional workers. Now, this is not as big a problem in Japan or a China or a Europe where the workforce is shrinking. Our workforce is expanding. So if you are 1 to 1.5 years behind where you were supposed to be, if the pandemic had not happened, you have about 1.5 crore extra workers in the economy. And that gap, I think, will take several years to bridge. So even if you're growing at, say, 7.5%, pre-pandemic trend line was about 6.5%. So you are going to close that gap, but it'll take several years to close that gap. So in that interim, the pricing power or the labor income or the labor share of overall income will be very low. The second aspect is that this is an investment-led recovery. So investment to GDP ratio is better than what it was. Now, when this happens, almost by definition, the consumption share will be lower. So between FY3 and FY8, 2003 and 2008, when the economy and the investments in the economy were growing faster, consumption was steadily growing slower than overall GDP growth, because that is just arithmetic. And when you put both of these together, for that, let me just clarify this rural-urban. I think, this divide, this analytical framework is not very useful these days. Remember that every village in India is now connected by road to a nearby Mufassil town. And so if someone picks up his motorcycle and travels 8 kilometers and buys something from a town, is that rural consumption or urban consumption? I think what is more important is to look at lower income consumption and upper income consumption. So when your labor does not have pricing power and capital has better pricing power, so there are structural aspects to it as well, because at this stage of development in the economy, there are more workers than there is capital. And therefore, capital share of income is going up. So the earnings of listed companies are growing faster than nominal GDP. And only the top 10, 15% are owners of capital in the economy. And therefore, the demand for luxury goods, this is a stage of the economy that every single, a stage of development that every single major economy has to go through, has gone through. So whether it was Japan 100 years back, US 100 years back, the UK 120, 130 years back, everyone has gone through this. So when this happens, overall consumption start getting dominated by what we call upper income consumption. Now, what can the finance minister do about it? I think that promoting activities which are labor intensive. So, for example, the real estate cycle is turning after nearly a decade-long downturn. Construction of real estate, construction of housing, if you recall the debates about 15 years back or 20 years back, was supposed to be the next best option to agriculture. So that's your classic transitory industry, which is semi-skilled, which can absorb surplus labor from agriculture and provide better quality incomes. And I think policies which promote real estate development, I think can go a very long way in creating or at least reducing this disparity of incomes that we are seeing right now.
So Nilkant Mishra's argument is that this is to do with the stage of India's economic development, and this has happened in countries like Japan and the United States, where it's largely the richer, the top 10-15% of the income pyramid who are doing most of the consumption, and it wasn't happening at the bottom of the income pyramid. The argument made by the likes of Arvind Subramaniam and the others, and I want Arun Kumar to build on that, is that it is government policies in India that are skewing consumption because they are designed in a way that they help the top two or the top industrialists, that they are benefiting because of the way policy is designed. Now, Nilkant Mishra's argument is that this happens in other countries at this stage of economic development. The likes of Arvind Subramaniam argue that no, it is because this government is pro-capitalist, therefore we are ending up with the kind of consumption patterns that the rich are getting richer, the poor are poorer. Arun Kumar, I want to draw you into that.
So, we cannot compare India at our stage of development with what happened in Japan or the US. Our structure of the economy is very different. We have a huge, unorganized sector. And, the recent data which came on the eShram portal, which the Prime Minister referred to, 30 crore people have registered in the unorganized sector. And 94% of them say they have an income of less than 10,000 rupees per month. Now, these people have a very low consumption. And that is why you see when the unorganized sector gets hit, both because of inflation and because of unemployment, your demand from the lower level of incomes that will fall. And because the income distribution is getting skewed in favor of the well-off segments, as Nilkant said, they consume very little, and therefore the consumption propensity in the economy drops. And that's why you see that the consumption is growing at only 3.5–4%, when the GDP is supposed to be growing at 7%. This shortage of demand that's there in the economy is reflected in the capacity utilization data. The RBI data on capacity utilization shows it's been hovering between 70 and 75%. That is inadequate. That may lead to some investment in certain sectors, but not overall in the economy. And when the investment levels are not rising, then the rate of growth gets affected. So I think this consumption thing would rise if incomes increase at the lower level, say in the unorganized sector, whether it be agriculture, where 46% of the workforce is, or in the micro sector, which employs 97.5% of the MSME sector. It is there when the income rises that your consumption will rise, and when the consumption share of GDP rises, that'll give a boost. I agree that if the consumption plus investment plus certain export minus import will all add up to one. But the point is that the consumption is the driving factor at this point of time. Investment can do that also, but provided demand is there. So if you only depend on investment, then what will happen is beyond a point, you will have a turnaround because the consumption is not rising accordingly. Therefore, you have to focus on the demand side more than on giving incentive to investment.
Okay, one of the other ways of looking at consumption is to look at FMCG sales. So if I look at how all these companies, like say a Hindustan Unilever or even a Patanjali, how are all these product sales going? We're looking at food and agro-based product sales. In financial year 23, the year-on-year change was only 8.3%. The year prior to that, the year-on-year change was 21.2%. We've seen, Dr. Mishra, so many of the chief executives at these FMCG majors come out, again, highlight the aspect of how in rural India sales aren't going, suggesting that in areas outside the cities that there is a consumption problem. What's your view on that, and how do you think Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman really ought to be dealing with it?
Rahul, these are all great points. Let me make three points somewhat related. The first is, I think when I look at 8% number, it's huge. 8% growth in any economy in the world, 8% growth in, consumption by FMCG sales is, pretty impressive. I don't know why 21.2, why FY22 had a 21.2 or, but, if you look at the trend in general, I think over 8% growth in consumption based on the measure you're showing is quite impressive. Number one. Number two, I think rural versus urban, I actually don't understand what you all are talking about, because, I have in front of me, several indicators of rural consumption. Two-wheeler registrations, CMI, rural consumer sentiments, major agriculture exports, and tractor registrations. If you look at tractor registrations and agricultural exports, they are at least, way above pre-pandemic levels. I think we know that two-wheeler registrations and rural, consumer sentiments were lagging, were below pre-pandemic levels, but now they are also back to pre-pandemic levels. So I actually don't understand what indicators you're looking at and what you're talking about. Third, I think Professor Arun Kumar made this point that look, we are a labor abundant economy, but increasingly we've been using capital intensive techniques, which is very counterintuitive if you look at any, if you think about any economic intuition. And that's why I think this problem has to be, and Neelkant had raised this point in the beginning, that is, we have to look at it in a more holistic way. So you have to combine consumption with employment, and you have to combine employment with trade and competitiveness. So we definitely need a boost to labor-intensive manufacturing if we want, to seize the demographic dividend, to have, higher consumption. And then again, we come back to the drawing board, and this is the time for difficult reforms in areas which are critical inputs into production, land and labor. And the job is, of course...
Is that possible? Is that likely? Given the kind of pushback we saw on land acquisition, given the kind of pushback we saw on farm reform?
Yeah, so the job is extremely difficult and intricate in a democracy. But of course, despite, but I think the survey makes a good point about, collective responsibility and a compact. Most of these things are state subjects. So if you really want to, make a push, everyone has to be responsible and accountable for it. And I think the survey very nicely makes this point about the compact and about collective responsibility of everyone to come together. Nobody can, achieve it. China +1 can be a surmountable challenge, but if you can, we do have to give another fillip to important reforms which are lagging behind. And on employment, I think we have to target sectors with export potential and in turn potential for domestic employment. And these are labor-intensive sectors. I think includes textile and apparel, food and beverage. I think there's no, and high-value agriculture. I think there's no. So these are basically the fundamentals. And I think Neelkant made this point that look, we don't need to, we can't just be throwing fiscal resources at these. We really need to go back to the drawing board and ask more fundamental questions.
So in the last part of this broadcast, I want to look at something that's been spoken of, Siddharth, which is a rural Manrega. Let me show you how the Manrega allocations have actually moved, and then talk us through whether you think some kind of an urban Manrega is actually sensible, desirable, feasible. Manrega, which is the, the amount of money that's given by the government for projects in rural areas, the allocation's largely been a flat line. In your view, is it sensible? Is it something the government seriously thinking about? What's the internal thinking right now?
Before I answer that, I just want to give you some data point on consumption. Dabur cut prices of its products and rural sales increased. One of the key things for the consumption debate is that cheezein mehengi ho gayi hain. When you go around, you went around in the elections, people tell you things have gotten priced out, cars, other automobiles, real estate. So let's leave that aside. On Manrega, it's been a consistent sort of statement of faith from the finance ministry well over the past 10 years, including post-COVID, that if rural demand so requires, we will increase the budgetary allocation. Now, let's come back to the larger point. How much does the government spend on direct, indirect employment? If you take out Manrega, which is the largest, let me just tell you the Atmanirbhar Bharat Rozgar Yojana, that alone spent close to 3,600 crore rupees as a post-COVID time-specific 3-year intervention in the market. So a lot of money gets spent, Rahul. But the key issue is, does the government need to come out with a new deal that perceptionally and on the ground makes it different to organized sector, non-farm employment? I think it's time for that. Will that happen tomorrow? At least I don't know the answer as yet.
I just want to look now at how the stock markets have been doing. One of the things that we've heard, Neelkant Mishra, from Madhuri Puri Buch, the SEBI chairperson, we heard it from the RBI, we've seen it in the economic survey, this gambling instinct. There are a lot of the retail investors are indulging in speculative trading in futures and options, 9 out of 10 losing money. Now everyone's speaking about it. It's almost as if the mahal is being built that this is dangerous, and it is, because it's moving money away from private savings into highly speculative activities. Now everyone's spoken about it. How do you think the government might intervene? Are they likely to do something, or are they more likely to leave it to the financial market regulators?
See, I have no idea what the government is going to do, but given that there is distortion created, and we've seen some comments from senior policymakers that the differential rates of taxation on various forms of savings have created incentives. So the fact that equity capital gains tax is lower than that on debt capital means that people, despite the fact that equity risk premium, I mean, just for the benefit of your audience, when you invest in a risky asset class like equities, you demand higher returns, or you should be only investing if you get higher returns than investing in a relatively safe asset class, which is like government bonds. Now, so that equity risk premium is currently at the lowest levels that we've ever recorded, which means that an investor would be much better off investing in government bonds than they would be in Indian equities. But still, the plumbing of savings is such that flows are happening disproportionately into equities and are not happening to sovereign bonds. So if these savings were to be switched to sovereign bonds, bond yields would come down, that they will bring down them, and then the cost of capital, the cost of mortgages, home loans become cheaper, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason why, so therefore, I think the government can, if it wants to, address this through reduction in the distortion in the, or the disparity in tax rates between fixed income and equity capital gains. Now, I don't know if that's a decision for the government to take, but this is something that, given, as you rightly said, every single policymaker has commented on excessive speculation. This is something that perhaps could be on the cards.
If that happens, could they create trouble on the markets?
I think, Rahul, not supporting F&O or taking any position on that, but I think a bit of the blame is unfair. Markets are also part of this. The economic survey makes a pointed remark about how much primary market capital has been raised. But tell me, in a time when interest rates have gone up very substantially by the RBI to fight inflation, how much fixed deposit rates have been increased by banks? Are banks passing it on to savers? So the second point is the distortion. What is the level of tax levied on fixed deposit income versus mutual funds? And there is a societal trend. The younger generation finds FDs boring. 3 years, no liquidity. Mutual funds liquidity at the tap of a button. So for the regulators, with due respect to them, while they make these remarks, India is changing. Look at how crypto came and went. You used a sledgehammer, and it happened globally, thankfully. But to just sort of vilify one part of the markets for this is completely unfair. Is tax the right way to treat this? I would disagree with Mr. Mishra and say no. I think the banks and the system needs to make fixed deposits more attractive rather than blaming market participants.
Rahul, if I may step in. Just
very quickly, I'm out of time. Yes, sir.
So 1 minute. It is conceptually incorrect. See, bank deposits in aggregate are a macro variable. Whether you put money into a mutual fund or not, you are still putting money into a bank account. So the aggregate deposits in the system do not change. And that's a conceptual clarity that we need to bring about. That the deposits in the system do not change whether you put money into a fixed deposit or into a mutual fund, because finally the money stays in bank deposits.
But the other philosophical question is, should the government tax those who want to indulge in speculative trading activities, or let them burn their fingers and learn their own lessons, which they will very quickly? or do they want to play nanny and tell the child what to do? So that's really something which is more a philosophical argument. We've been able to cover some interesting ground, some sharp thoughts there. I want to thank our guests for joining us. We hope to have you back during our budget coverage. We start early in the morning looking at different aspects, and the good thing is that the Budget Intelligence Dashboard really puts a lot of these conversation points in context. You can see how the numbers have been moving over the past several years, which gives you a framework for analysis and for understanding. I'm slipping into a break. We'll have more for you when we come back on the other side. I look forward to seeing you at 9 a.m. tomorrow.
To say hello, I'm so fly. You took a nosedive. Careful when you play on my level. For you it's so. Hey, hello.
Motorola Razr 50 Ultra. Flip the script.
Hello, Moto.
Co-presented by एक हिंट तो देते हिंट बड़े आराम से
विक्रम आ तो गए, जाओगे कैसे?
बड़े आराम से।
देखिए ये देश
हेलो, मैं आ रहा हूँ और हाँ, भगा कर ले जाऊंगा। सिक्योरिटी! प्रिया! भाग गई, पकड़ो उनको! हेलो! बोला था ना, भगा कर ले जाऊंगा। विक्रम!
एक हिंट तो देते?
हिंट।
बड़े आराम से।
Join us as we explain the impact of the first budget of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's third term.
Your investments, your future. Watch how the budget drives India's Atmanirbhar markets.
From taxes to healthcare, from Manrega to Ayushman Bharat, we bring you all the policy moves.
Get expert insights on how Nirmala Sitharaman's 7th budget affects your finances.
Decode the big numbers and the new policies shaping our nation's future. Tune in to Business Today for Modinomics 3.0 live on Budget Day.
Make your media plan smarter with India Today Live TV on your connected devices. Amplify your brand with 100 million smart internet viewers. To advertise, mail us at sales@aajtak.com.
पब्लिक एग्जामिनेशन की रेगुलरिटीज में बिल लाए, कानून बनाए। क्या मजबूरी था कांग्रेस पार्टी की, क्या मजबूरी था नेता प्रतिपक्ष की? उन्होंने उस बिल को उल्टा किया, किसके दबाव में उल्टा किया?
अभी मेरा नीट पे फोकस है, क्योंकि ये बहुत ज़रूरी मुद्दा है युवाओं के लिए, और काफ़ी मुश्किल हो रही है। हमने कहा था कि इस पे डिस्कशन होना चाहिए, सरकार इंटरेस्टेड नहीं है, मगर हम इस मुद्दे को उठाते रहेंगे। मंत्री जी ने सुप्रीम कोर्ट की बात करी, प्रधानमंत्री की बात करी, मगर मंत्री जी को शायद ये बातें समझ नहीं आ रही हैं और वो ये नहीं बता पा रहे हैं कि वो इसके बारे में क्या कर रहे हैं।
Make your media plan smarter with India Today Live TV on your connected devices. Amplify your brand with 100 million smart internet viewers. To advertise, mail us at sales@aajtak.com.
Presented by JK Tyre, Desh Ka Tyre. Co-presented by New Seltos with Kia Connect. Tech is now badass.
Good evening, hello and welcome. You're with the news today, your primetime destination news, newsmakers, talking points. It's that big budget week in Parliament. The economic survey is out. Is India really better off than other large economies across the world? Is the economy as rosy as the survey suggests? We'll talk about that. Also, we'll be talking to Asaduddin Owaisi on the Supreme Court's Khawar Yatra order. And we'll raise the big debate. Proper for government employees to join RSS activities or not? That's going to be our face-off tonight. Plenty more on the show, but first, as always, it's time for the 9 headlines at 9. The countdown begins to Budget 2024. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman tables the economic survey, shows India's real GDP grew by 8.2%. Opposition accuses government of cherry-picking data to paint a rosy picture. Prime Minister Modi has a big message for the opposition ahead of Budget Day, says India bloc disrupting House to hide own failures, reiterates no one can gag the Prime Minister's voice. Opposition hits back, says the government isn't allowing them to raise the real issues. Supreme Court directs an IIT Delhi panel to probe the NEET paper with 2 correct answers. Rahul Gandhi and Education Mantri Dharmendra Pradhan face off in Parliament over the paper leak issue. Supreme Court puts Uttar Pradesh's Khawar Yatra diktat on hold, says shopkeepers don't need to display names, only food that's served. Opposition hails the verdict. Centre lifts a 58-year-old ban on government employees participating in RSS activities. Congress claims it's bureaucracy in knickers. RSS hails the move. IT firms propose a 14-hour workday in Karnataka. Siddaramaiah cabinet to consider the proposal. IT employees protest, call 14 hours workday inhumane. JDS Neta Suraj Revanna gets conditional bail in the unnatural sex assault cases against him. The brother of sex abuse accused Prajwal Revanna not allowed to travel outside India. Terror attack thwarted in Jammu and Kashmir, Rajouri. Counter-terror operation mount. Sources say at least 40 terrorists hiding in the Jammu region. America deals with Biden for Joe Biden as he drops out of the White House race. VP Kamala Harris emerges as the front-runner for the Democratic nomination. Donald Trump mocks Biden for dropping out. But our top story tonight. The first budget of the Modi NDA 3.0 government will be presented tomorrow in Parliament. Today, the economic survey was tabled by the Finance Minister, which says India's economic growth has been resilient, with growth pegged at 8.2% this fiscal year. But the opposition says the government is presenting a rosy picture of the economy, hiding some of the realities, especially on food inflation and jobs. What really is the state of the Indian economy? That's our top focus.
Sir, with your permission, I rise today on the...
Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman tabled the economic survey on Monday. The survey, which pegged growth at 8.2% in fiscal year 2024, says the economy is on strong wicket and stable footing. The GDP in financial year 2024 was 20% higher than in financial year 2020, when the pandemic hit, a feat accomplished by only a few countries. The survey pegs financial year 2025 growth estimate at 6.5 to 7%, down from 7.2%. It says India will become the third largest economy by 2030, but lists the challenge in building manufacturing base. The survey says it may not be prudent to think India can take up slack from China vacating certain spaces in manufacturing. The focus should be on bottom-up structural reforms. The survey, while admitting food prices remain high, warns of global challenges ahead.
There is global protectionism and a sense of nationalism just in time giving way to the idea of just in case. Security dominates efficiency. Supply security dominates supply efficiencies. And you can see that in the last 3-4 years, protective actions have actually moved up very, very sharply. Trade protective actions.
The economic survey dwells on the jobs challenge in considerable detail. It says 78.51 lakh jobs need to be generated every year in non-farm sector. 65% of India's population is under 35. Only 51.25% of the country's youth is deemed employable. The survey specifically points out that new technologies like artificial intelligence will alter the jobs scenario massively.
The impact of AI is still not very well understood across the world. While the GCC kind of jobs may not be very easily affected in the near term, some of the business process outsourcing jobs may be affected, which AI can very easily done. Medical transcript reading, image creation, animation, etc. can be easily taken over. So India may have a slight short-term negative impact followed by a medium-term positive impact. Therefore, it is necessary for the Indian corporate sector, both information technology and non-IT sector, to find the right balance between deployment of technology and deployment of labor.
The economic survey prescribes bottom-up structural reforms. These include reducing compliance requirements for small enterprises, reforms in the farm sector, and changes in labor laws. Bureau Report, India Today.
Let's raise the big questions on that economic survey. Is India now better off than other large economies? Is the economy as rosy as the economic survey suggests? Do food inflation, job creation remain the major challenges? What are the risk factors going ahead for the Indian economy? Joining me now is Pranjul Bhandari, Chief Economist, India and Indonesia at HSBC. Madan Sabnavis is Chief Economist, Bank of Baroda. Rajiv Kumar, noted Senior Economist, former Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog. And Professor Santosh Mehrotra, author Reviving Jobs and Agenda for Growth, visiting professor at the University of Bath. I appreciate all of you joining us. Pranjul, to you first. What's your big takeaway from the economic survey? I'll ask that to all four of you, but why don't you start first?
Yeah, thank you, Rajdeep. Great to be here. So look, it's second term, it's second innings for our finance minister. And as you know, in Test cricket, second innings are a great opportunity to improve your batting average and take your team towards victory. So this is a very important part and time in the economy. And I think it's very important to get the context right. Where are we? What's gone right? What's gone wrong? How do we course correct if we have to? And I think taking a step back, a couple of things are going very well. Number one, the government has been doing a lot of infrastructure investment, which has been good for growth. Number two, there is a lot of real estate activity. A lot of jobs in the construction sectors have been created. But on the other hand, consumption is quite weak, quite tepid. It's in the low single digits. And that's really what needs to be addressed at this point of time if you really want GDP growth to continue to be in the 6.5% to 7% range. So I think this is the big challenge we have in front of us. Now that we have the budget tomorrow, I think a couple of things they've been doing right, and my sense is they should continue to do that. One of them is bringing down the fiscal deficit year after year. a very important way to keep macro stability intact, which is important to make growth a multi-year phenomenon rather than just a single-year phenomenon. They've also been doing a lot of capital expenditure on roads, rails. They should continue to do that. But they haven't probably been doing much on consumption. And I think that's where they really need to beef up, to do more of a rural stimulus, welfare stimulus, perhaps more in the housing sector at this point of time, but in a responsible way. And it's possible this time because the government is actually more revenue rich than it has been in a very long time. It's got the RBI dividend, it's got great tax collections. If it brings all of that together, it can give you both fiscal consolidation and a little bit of the consumption push that was missing from the budget that we had back in February.
Interesting, Pranjal. There, Professor Rajiv Kumar, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, your big takeaway from the economic survey, is it as rosy as the government suggests? Are